phones, Babylons can't crack the code.
What it do, YouTube? B. Kelly back again with another banger. Today's video, I'm going to make my Pac12 football predictions for the 2020 college football season. Now, the first division I'm going to talk about is the North Division. With my first place spot in the North Division, I have Oregon. Now, Oregon has a very good football team, even though they just lost their starting quarterback and NFL draftee Justin Herbert. Now, I think Oregon's still going to be a very good team because they have a lot of star power and a very good defense and a very good offensive line. And the Pac-12's not the strongest conference, and I think Oregon's going to go 11-1 on the year. They don't have the toughest schedule ever, but they do have some tough games. They open up at home against North Dakota State, which is going to be a very tough game. Trey Lance and the North Dakota State Bisons, they're a very good team, and I think that game's going to be very close, but I'm going to give it to Oregon. Then they play against Ohio State. I have Justin Fields and Ohio State winning this game to make Oregon 1-1 on the season. Then I have Oregon beating Hawaii, Colorado, Washington, California, Stanford, Arizona, USC, Arizona State, Washington State, and Oregon State, all to get 10 straight wins on the season to make them 11-1 going into the Pac-12 championship game. And will they win that game? I do not know. I think it's going to be a toss-up depending on who they play. Now, I think the best case scenario for Oregon is an 11-1 season, and the worst case scenario would have to be a 9-3 season, losing to Ohio State, North Dakota State, and Arizona State. Maybe even 8-4 if they lose to USC. With my second place spot, I have Washington. Now, I'm predicting Washington to go 8-4, even though they have some question marks at the quarterback spot since Jacob Eason got drafted. Now, I'm predicting them to lose their home opener versus Michigan, but then I have them beating Sacramento State and Utah State in back-to-back games. But then I have them losing to Oregon right after the Utah State game. Then I have them beating Oregon State, then losing to Utah, beating Arizona, losing to Cal, beating Stanford, losing to USC, beating Colorado, and beating Washington State in the final two games to go 8-4. I would say best case scenario for the Washington Huskies is to go 9-3 if they can beat Cal. But I would say the worst case scenario for Washington would have to be a 7-5, actually no, change that, a 6-6 season. Because if they cannot beat Colorado or Washington State in their final two games, they will go 6-6, but I believe they can be an 8-4 team. With my third place spot, I have Cal. Now, Cal has a very good defense and honestly a pretty good secondary. But Cal's offense is not the best, and I'm going to predict a 7-5 season, but they could potentially finish second in the Pac-12 this season yet again. But I'm going to predict a 7-5 record for Cal. Now, I do have them winning their first game of the season at UNLV, then I have them losing their home opener against TCU, then beating Cal Poly the next game, then losing to Utah, then beating Washington State, then losing to USC and Oregon in back-to-back games, then beating Oregon State and Washington in back-to-back games, then losing to Arizona State, but then beating Stanford and UCLA in their final two games of the season. I would say the best case scenario for Cal would honestly probably be a 8-4 season. And the worst case scenario would have to be a 6-6 season in my eyes, and possibly a 5-7 season. But I think they will most likely go 7-5 in regular season play and potentially go 8-4. With my fourth place spot in the North Division, I have Washington State. Now, I have Washington State getting off to a very hot start to the season, beating Utah State, beating Houston, beating Idaho, and beating Oregon State. But then I have them losing to Cal, and then losing to Utah. But then I have them bouncing back and beating Stanford, then losing to Arizona State, and then beating Colorado. But then I have them losing to UCLA, Oregon, and Washington in their last three games of the season. Now, I'm expecting a little bit of a regression for Washington State without Mike Leach. I think Mike Leach is a very good football coach. But I feel like they're still a team that can go to a bowl game. Now, I would say best case scenario for Washington State would honestly be to go 7-5, maybe even 8-4, or 8-4, 7-5. I think that's the best case scenario. And I would say worst case scenario for them would probably have to be going 5-7. But I truly think Washington State will be able to go to a bowl game this upcoming season, whether it's 6-6, 7-5, 8-4. But I'm going to say they're going to go 6-6 on the season. With my 5th place spot, I have Stanford. Now, Stanford was a disappointing team last year. The offense was pretty banged up, so was the defense. The defense isn't bad, but the offense was horrendous without their starting quarterback, KJ Castillo, once he got hurt. And, well, he left to Mississippi State after he went into the transfer portal. And that's going to hurt. There's a big question mark at the quarterback position. And honestly, I don't see the offense being any better than last season. I'm predicting a 4-8 record for the year. And I have them beating William & Mary in Arizona in their first 2 games. So then I have them going on a bad losing streak. Losing to USC, UCLA, Notre Dame, Washington State, Oregon. But then I have them bouncing back and beating Oregon State. But then I have them losing to Washington, Colorado, and Cal 3 games in a row. But then I do have them kind of pulling off a slight upset in their final game of the season. They're home. I do have them beating BYU. But let's talk about the best case and worst case scenarios. Now, best case scenario for them, honestly, I would say they would be bowl eligible. I think they do have a potential to go 7-5 and possibly 8-4. But the worst case scenario would honestly be what I see is a 3-9 season. But I'm going to say they're going to go 4-8. But they could do better. Remember, these are just really early predictions. With my last place spot in the Pac12 North Division, I have Oregon State. Now, Oregon State did surprise some people last year, going 5-7. But I don't see Oregon State doing that again. They lost too much production from last year to repeat that, and some of the people they lost were some of their best players. I'm going to predict a 2-10 season yet again. And I have them losing their first game at OSU. And then I have them winning their only 2 games of the season, back-to-back, beating Colorado State and Portland State. Then I have them losing on a very, very bad losing streak. Losing to Washington State, Arizona State, Washington, Cal, Stanford, UCLA, Utah, Arizona, and Oregon in the final game of the season. Now, best case scenario for Oregon State in my eyes, honestly, would probably be to go 3-9. But I don't think that's going to happen. Worst case scenario is to go 1-11. Next up is the Pac12 South Division. Now, just a heads up before I talk about the standings in the Pac12 South Division, I think the top 3 spots could be anywhere, honestly, because I feel like all those 3 teams are very close together right now, and anyone can take that number 1 spot. But right now, I got to give it to USC. I think USC is only going to have 1 conference loss, potentially. Now, I'm predicting a 9-3 record is my prediction, because if you look at their out-of-conference schedule, it's pretty tough. Now, I have them losing their first game at Alabama in Texas. And I have them losing that game. Then I have them beating New Mexico, beating Stanford, beating ASU, beating Utah, beating Cal, beating Arizona, beating Colorado, but then losing to Oregon, but then beating Washington, UCLA, until they go to their final game of the season versus Notre Dame. In the Coliseum, I have them losing that game. Now, like I said, these top 3 spots, anyone can finish first place. But what I gotta say is the best case scenario for them, honestly, is probably going to go 10-2 on the season. Because I don't see them beating Alabama or Oregon, but they could potentially beat Notre Dame. I really don't feel like they're that far off from them. But, again, I have Notre Dame winning that game. I think they can win that game pretty easily on them, but USC can definitely put up a battle. Now, let's talk about the worst case scenario in this season. Now, I think they can beat Utah no matter what this year because Utah did lose quite a bit of production from last year and a lot of players that were starters. Actually, I'm pretty sure they lost some of the most starting players in the NCAA this past season, if I'm not wrong. Not the most, but one of the most. But I would say the worst case scenario for USC would go 8-4 because honestly, I think ASU can beat them, but the question is, will they be able to beat them in the Coliseum, of course. Now, that is my predictions for the first place spot in the Pac12 South division. With my second place spot, I have Arizona State. Now, Arizona State might have had some ups and downs last season, but Jaden Daniels and that young squad, they have a very good future there at Arizona State, and I feel like they could make some noise this year. Now I'm predicting a 10-2 record on the season. I have them beating Northern Arizona in their first game, then beating UNLV, then beating BYU, but then losing to USC, but then getting back on a winning streak, beating Oregon State, UCLA, Colorado, Washington State, Cal, but then losing to Oregon, then beating Utah and Arizona. Now, best case scenario I see for Arizona State is being 11-1, beating USC. And worst case scenario would honestly probably be 9-3, losing to Utah, but I don't think they're going to lose to Utah this season. It could be very close, though. I'm not going to count that off, though. So I'm predicting Arizona State to be 10-2 on the season. With my third place spot, I have Utah. Now, Utah lost a lot of production from this past year going into this season due to seniors in the NFL draft. But they still have a pretty easy schedule, so I'm predicting a 10-2 record for Utah. Now, I do have them getting off to a pretty hot start, beating BYU, Montana State, Wyoming, and Cal in their first 4 games, but then I have them losing to USC. But then I have them bouncing back, beating Washington State, Washington, UCLA, Arizona, Oregon State, all in a row. But then I have them losing to ASU in Tempe, Arizona, in Sun Devil Stadium. But I have them winning their final game of the season, beating Colorado in Boulder. But let's talk about the best case scenario. I do think the best case scenario for them is a 10-2 season. Now, worst case scenario, honestly, I'm going to say the worst case scenario for them is probably an 8-4 to 9-3 season. More than likely 9-3 than 8-4 because they're still not a bad football team. With my fourth place spot, I have UCLA. Now, UCLA has been very disappointing under Chip Kelly so far, making 0 bowl games and honestly not showing the most improvement with their recruits. Now, I think they're going to show the most improvement this season so far, since most of the recruits they have are redshirt sophomores and juniors, and I think they'll be able to actually make a bowl game this year with the potential, because I think DTR will improve a lot from last season. I have them going 7-5 on the year. I have them beating New Mexico State and Hawaii, but then lose to San Diego State, then beat Stanford and Arizona, losing to Arizona State, beat Colorado, lose to Utah, beat Oregon State and Washington State, but then lose the final 2 games of the season, losing to USC and Cal. Now, best case scenario I see is 8-4, beating San Diego State to be 8-4, but I would say the worst case scenario would honestly be a 5-7 to 6-6 year. And I have to say this, if Chip Kelly does not make a bowl game this year, he is going to be on the hot seat for next year. With my 5th place spot, I have Colorado. Now, Colorado is under some new coaching, and I feel like they have potential for the future, but I feel like this season will be a little rough. I have them beating Colorado State and Fresno State in their first 2 games, but then losing to Texas A&M and Oregon in the next 2. But then I have them beating Arizona, but then losing to UCLA, Arizona State, and USC, and losing to Washington State as well. But then I have them beating Stanford, then losing to Washington and Utah. Now, that is honestly the worst case scenario I see in that season. But I would say the best case scenario would be a 6-6 record, maybe even 7-5. With my last place spot in the South Division, I have Arizona. Arizona did lose some pretty key pieces from their team last year, such as Khalil Tate. And I don't know how the next quarterback is going to be. I am predicting a 3-9 record. I have them beating Hawaii and Portland State in their first 2 games. But then I have them losing to Stanford, Texas Tech, UCLA, Colorado, USC, Washington, Oregon, Utah. But then I have them beating Oregon State, then losing to Arizona State. Now, I think this is a worst case scenario for them, but I could see the best case scenario, honestly, being a 5-7 record. Well guys, that's the end of the video. If you guys like this video, remember to smash that like button, turn on the post notifications, and subscribe for more videos.